Hey guys, welcome back. I hope everyone has been enjoying the lecture series up to this point. Today we are going to begin by talking about the major break between Britain and America, and that is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We're going to move in to talk about some of the major battles that took place in the Northern Theater and see how Washington was maneuvering around and frankly taking loss after loss. But we'll see how they respond, and then next time we will shift towards the Southern Theater and wrap it all up and talk about what happened in peacetime. So, just a couple reminders. Please make sure you are taking notes, and please communicate with me if you have any questions. All right, well, let's go ahead and jump into it. So, starting off from rebellion to independence. You have most likely heard of the pamphlet that made its way around the colonies called Common Sense. This was written by a philosopher named Thomas Paine in 1776. And the big thing I want you to know from Common Sense is that this is really the moment where we start shifting blame from Parliament to the king for the colonial troubles. The quote here, the common sense of the matter, that's how Thomas Paine referred to it, the common sense of the matter is that King George is to blame. If the English Constitution is too corrupt, to allow a tyrant like King George III to come to power, then it is too corrupt for the American system, and we need a full break. So, not only saying that we're shifting the blame from Parliament to the king, but this also makes the argument for full independence. That was not something that had been agreed upon by the colonies up to this point. Last we saw, the last resolution was, of course, calling for the olive branch petition. There have been, there's still this debate raging on whether we should push for independence or are we going to ultimately try to side, or push our differences aside and make peace with Britain. Well, let's talk about the circulation rates. Within 3 months of the publication of this, 150,000 copies are being passed around the colonies. Now, that's just how many were passed around. What was often common practice was to read it and then pass it along to a neighbor. So you can easily multiply that by 3, 4, maybe even 5 different people that would get their hands on almost all of these copies. So what you're having is this pamphlet being read by over 500,000 people, most likely. This will help unite the message. And I guess I shouldn't kind of pause. We often look back on these times and think that most people are uneducated. The American colonies were actually some of the most literate locations in the entire globe at the time. Research has suggested that adult literacy, even in rural areas, was around 70%. In the cities, that often exceeded 90% literacy. Now, compare this to Europe, where the literacy rates were somewhere between 40, 70%, so much lower than what you see in the American colonies. So people are reading this, and they are uniting under this message. So, as I said, this is going to be what pushes Americans, to have a more unified stance and really debate whether independence is what we should pursue. Now, I would like to mention, before I move on, Thomas Paine himself. I feel worse for him than any other so-called founding father. Thomas Paine, you would think, would become very wealthy, become very famous from this. The first print of Common Sense did make a lot of money. His publisher kept it all. His publisher, a man named Robert Bell, kept all of the proceeds from Common Sense, and Paine really didn't have anything. Now, there were later editions of Common Sense that were printed, but Paine used the money, the profits from that, because it was during the war, and actually used the profits to buy basically mittens for the soldiers in the Continental Army. So, very generous there. But by the time Thomas Paine ended up towards the later part of his life, he ended up penniless. He was completely poor. He had lost all the money or given away all the money that he had made from his writing, and died in relative poverty. And even sadder than that, his funeral was attended by less than 10 people. And if you think that's the worst insult, it gets even darker for Thomas Paine. Even after he died, he was buried in the Americas. The decision was made to actually exhume his body and take it back to England. And of course, on that trip, the ship carrying his body sank and he was lost at sea. So, poor Thomas Paine. Let's move on to the Lee Resolution, July 2nd, 1776. This was an initial motion passed by the Second Continental Congress. It was proposed by Richard Henry Lee. He will be one of the heroes of the Revolution, and actually, I believe the father, I should know this, but the father of Robert E. Lee, who will, of course, make such an impact during the Civil War. So there was some connection there between major American historical events. Now, this proposal, what it did was it created a committee of 5. It suggested 5 people were selected to come up and draft a declaration. It wasn't saying that they would pass a resolution declaring independence. It was just saying we need to have a resolution ready if we feel the need to declare independence. So the 5 people that were selected were John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston. They were all appointed. This committee debated independence and drew up ultimately a declaration, with Thomas Jefferson writing most of that. They came up with other decisions as well. There was another committee that had been formed to prepare treaties with foreign nations. That's going to be a big deal later on. If you can get a foreign nation in on your side, that's going to be a big deal. Let me get that taskbar away at the bottom. There we go. Okay. So they're going to draft a resolution on trying to get treaties with foreign nations. They also are in the middle of drafting a constitution that would, in some ways, create a confederation of states. Okay, and that'll come later on. So ultimately, the Articles of Confederation, as it is called, will be passed in 1777. Not quite there yet. Let's move on to perhaps the most important piece today, and that is the writing and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Often seen and celebrated as our Independence Day, July 4th, 1776. I always like to remind kids that even though we declared our independence, we would still be fighting for another 6 years to secure that independence. Now, what the Declaration of Independence did was it announced our separation and our sovereignty from Great Britain. It was written mainly by Jefferson, and it includes a list of grievances towards King George and an assertion of natural and legal rights. You might remember in our first lecture, we talked a little bit about the idea of natural rights, and it is solidified here forever in our Declaration, saying that we have these rights. They are given to us by God, not by man, and those rights are being abused and denied. Now, ironically, and this is a factoid I just learned recently, ironically, in this declaration, there is no mention, there's no specific use of the word independence. Okay, now, of course, they are, this is the ultimate goal of the Declaration, is to push for independence, but that word is actually not used in the text itself or the title. There were 25 original prints that were made of the Declaration of Independence, there were actually more than that. 25 remain. Okay, we know of 25 prints that still remain with us. The most recent copy was actually found in 1989. It was hidden in a painting. It was in the back of a painting. Someone had purchased it at a flea market for $4, and when they opened up the back of the frame, they realized they had an original copy of the Declaration of Independence. They turned that $4 into an investment that ultimately netted them $2.4 million. I still think that might be a little low for an original copy, but I want to take some time and read you just a little bit of the wording of the Declaration, because these are Thomas Jefferson is one of my favorite figures from this period, and so eloquent with how he was able to push his ideas out there, and so I couldn't say it any better than he could. So I want to read you just a little bit of this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future security. Now that is the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, but it outlines the philosophical argument that Jefferson was trying to get across. And you'll notice the use of natural rights, of God-given rights, and also allusions to the social contract. In this case, they believe that Britain has broken that contract. They are not only not providing security, but they are actually, abolishing the ability to represent themselves. And so, despotism is the key word there. So Jefferson publishes this. The committee does put it forward, and ultimately it is signed. It is adopted and signed July 4th, 1776. Now, we are going to move on to kind of a new section of our notes here, and we're going to talk about the battles. Now, I will not be going too far in depth with these, the movement of the troops. I'll talk just a little bit about that. I'm going to hit a lot of battles here, and I'm going to give you, first of all, I will give you a lot of numbers. Like I said in my last lecture, guys, I'm not expecting you to memorize these details, okay? These are things that are given to you not only for chronological sake, but to give you an idea, a visual, in your mind, a visual sense of what is happening on the ground. I will always try to focus and really kind of slow down and tell you what is the most important, key thing that came out of this battle. That is what you really need to know. If you can identify what is the main thing that this battle resulted in, that is the piece that I really want you to take away. Before we begin with the detail, I want you to take a look at the map. First of all, a lot of fighting throughout. Most of the time we think of the American colonies, we just focus on Boston and New York. But in reality, this was a war that not only extended into Canada, but all the way down into South Carolina and close to the Georgia border there. It really comes in waves, right? So early on, we've already seen some of this action. We've seen the British arrive in Boston, take over that city. We've seen them move then from Boston to New York. We've seen the invasion of Canada by American forces. We've seen the repulsion of those forces by the Canadians and British. So a lot of this map has already taken place. But what we're going to see is that this war is fought in two waves. Okay, the first wave is happening in the Northern Theater. So you can see there's a pretty big break right there around Maryland and Virginia. A lot of this fighting early on is happening in the North. Later on, the British are going to start shifting their strategy, and then it's going to move towards the South. So we'll see that ultimately, the war kind of, it wraps up somewhat in the North, the middle colonies, but we'll see that the later years of the war, 1780, 81, 82, are really taking place in the South. All right. Let's get into it. So the Northern Theater, as I said, that's what we're going to focus on today. First major battle we're going to talk about is this took place in New York, the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. This took place on Long Island in August 27th, 1776. The big thing you need to know is this is the first major battle that took place after the Declaration of Independence. In terms of troop size, it was also the largest battle of the American Revolution. The British had 20,000 men, and the Americans had, and again, asterisks on the Americans, right? I mean, it's not necessarily a cohesive unit. The Continental Army, is what I should say, had 10,000 men. So you're looking at 30,000 guys that are engaged in this battle. That is a large fighting force for the time. Now, Washington had set up to defend Manhattan, and General Howe, for the British, had set up on Staten Island. Um, Ultimately, you can see there that the forces. Ultimately, the British were able to kind of surround Washington's army there on Long Island and push them out. This is a loss for the for the Continental Army. About 20% of U.S. forces were casualties or even captured. Many of them were captured. The British at this point, they were kind of looking for one big battle. They think they have it. They're preparing for a siege of New York. But Washington, as he will do multiple times, is able to withdraw before the rest of his army can be crushed. So he withdraws under cover of darkness, and he basically flees into New Jersey. And New Jersey, from New Jersey into Pennsylvania. Now, this is not exactly a big morale boost for the Americans that they are running, with their tail between their legs and suffering such intense casualties. So, there needs to be a quick turnaround. There needs to be a quick shift if we are going to win this thing. So right away, we're looking like we're already the underdogs, and it's looking even worse than before. Fast forward to December. It takes a long time for these troops to move around. It takes a long time for these armies to get, with just simple wagons. And you think about the roads at this period. It's very difficult to move an entire army around. So the next major battle, there was some fighting in between, but the next major battle took place at the Battle of Trenton. This was the day after Christmas, December 26, 1776. Now, I mentioned in the last lecture about the British use of mercenaries, and in particular a group called the Hessians. Today they would be located in Germany. The Hessians were soldiers for hire, and I guess perhaps apologize to them, but perhaps the propensity of Germans to engage in drink, especially around festive holidays like Christmas. So there may have been some of that going on. The Hessians imbibing perhaps a little too much on Christmas Day, a little groggy on Christmas morning, but Washington uses that to his advantage. Now, by the way, I should mention that the use of Hessians was so upsetting to the Americans that this is actually listed in the Declaration of Independence itself as one of their grievances, that the British were using mercenaries against them. So, this is something that the Americans feel like, violating whether the rules of war, if you want to say it like that, or just, the fact that they're hiring outside forces to fight against fellow Englishmen. This is definitely one of the major grievances. Well, in Trenton, New Jersey, the Hessians had taken up what are called their winter quarters. Okay, it's very difficult to fight in the snow, so usually both sides would kind of agree to take winter quarters. So they're holed up in Trenton, New Jersey. Colonel Rall, R-A-L-L, he is a Hessian colonel. He was in command there at Trenton, and frankly, he underestimated the American forces. He did not had a very low opinion of the Continental Army. In fact, he had openly called them provincial clowns. So, didn't have too much respect for them. Evidence suggests that Rall was actually warned about an imminent American attack on Trenton, but disregarded it. That would end up, of course, being very costly for him and even more costly for the British. Now, that picture in the bottom left, one of my favorite paintings of all time, Washington crossing the Delaware, one of these key moments that will forever be remembered in American history. Now, I will warn you, this is, we try to dispel myths as they come apart. This is not at all what it looked like. You have this very heroic, very patriotic view of Washington. And by the way, I've seen this picture live in person. It is at the Met in New York, and I was shocked to see actually the size of this thing. It's about, if memory serves me correct, it's about 10 feet tall, like 15 feet wide. It's enormous. And honestly, it kind of took my breath away when I walked in the room it's housed in. Gorgeous painting, not very accurate. It had snowed, but pushing through ice chunks like the Titanic here, not exactly. So anyways, just kind of keep that in mind. Well, it was Christmas night that Washington decided to cross the Delaware River and make their way into, or at least towards Trenton, New Jersey. The weather was terrible. The weather was bad. Rain, sleet, snow. And during this crossing, a few guys did fall into the river, but no one ended up dying. Now, Washington would attack the Hessians in Trenton with 2,400 men, and there were 1,500 Hessians there located in the town. Like I said, most of them were still feeling the effects of Christmas the night before, and so they were not really ready to fight. They're in winter quarters. They don't think anybody's coming, and all of a sudden to Washington, to surprise attack them. The Washington's Continental Army was able to either kill or capture almost the entire Hessian force at Trenton. This had tremendous effects on not only in realistic numbers. Like I said, every soldier lost for the British is much more important, frankly, than every soldier lost for the Americans. But also in terms of morale. I mean, we were not doing well up to this point. I mean, New York was gone. Boston was gone. So, for Washington to get a key defeat, to defeat the enemy here, that was a major, major morale booster. Do not underestimate the role of morale in fighting wars, because that directly leads to more people recruiting and enrolling into the fighting forces. Re-enlistments, a lot of guys had started giving up and just dropping out and going AWOL. So this slowed down desertion and frankly gave a boost in other theaters. So this was a major moment in the war. Now, from Trenton, they were able to capture the forces there. But from Trenton, Washington is going to back out, and he's going to make his way towards Princeton. Okay, Princeton's a little bit further north in New Jersey there. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right here. So we've gone from basically Trenton to Princeton. That's going to be the next stop for Washington. He knew that the main bulk of the British forces were going to come attack Trenton, and he didn't want to be stuck there. So the next location is there at the Battle of Princeton. January 3rd, 1777. While in New York, General Howe had set up headquarters in New York. He sent another general, General Cornwallis, who will, of course, become very infamous at the end of this war. He sends Cornwallis into New Jersey to basically retake Trenton. There was an initial failed attack at Trenton, and this is when Washington withdrew. He did not want Cornwallis to surround Trenton. He withdraws under nightfall once again to Princeton, where Cornwallis had left basically an outpost. Okay, so Cornwallis had kind of set up camp here and then had gone to attack Trenton. And basically under cover of darkness, Washington kind of reverses course and takes out that smaller group back at Trenton. This will be the last major action of Washington's winter campaign. We see that or the New Jersey campaign, sorry. American morale is really left at a positive note here because, coming off 2 victories, and we do see a rise in enlistments following this. Now, I want to talk about what Washington is really doing here, because this is a strategy that's been used since ancient times, and it's called the Fabian strategy, named after a Roman general. What Washington is doing is avoiding the big fights, okay? And that's what I want you to know about Princeton. He's using this war of attrition, right? He's not going after the British main army, right? He's attacking smaller groups, taking them out, and then basically going on the run until they can regroup and attack a smaller group. So the British are starting to just chase Washington around. And it works. I mean, it's very difficult. Remember, we are fighting. We got home field advantage here. All right. So the Americans understand the layouts. They understand how to adapt to the territory a lot more than the British do. This Fabian strategy, very, very important. It's constant harassment of the enemy, and basically slowly picking them off instead of waiting for one big battle. I want to talk about the Battle of Brandywine. And I've gotten, I'm sorry, I guess my notes here have gotten a little bit out of order. We'll come back to Brandywine a little bit later on. I'll mention the importance of that later. But September 11th, so we're kind of fast forwarding here, September 1777. By this point, of course, winter quarters is over. Washington's on the move again. And there are major battles happening throughout, but we are skipping ahead to Brandywine. In this case, General Howe for the British is going to draw Washington's army into a battle here at Brandywine. Before they can really engage, Washington is going to withdraw, and Howe takes advantage of that by moving his forces towards Philadelphia. Now, the capital of the Second Continental Congress, we talked about Philadelphia multiple times. Washington is going to basically dig in at Brandywine and try to protect that further advancement towards Philadelphia. So at this point, basically, Washington's kind of put himself between the main general, the main army of the British, and General Howe, and Philadelphia, the somewhat capital. Okay, Washington's right in the middle. Howe does attack, and ultimately, Washington is defeated at Brandywine. The result is that Howe, General Howe, is, and that's Howe. I don't believe I have it up here, but General Howe is able to defeat the Americans at Brandywine, and they are able to move and take Philadelphia. Now, this is this is perhaps a bigger loss than, or morale decrease than the loss of New York. And not only that, but we're getting very close to another period of winter quarters, and this is going to prove one of the worst winters in history. And that takes place at Valley Forge. You probably have heard of Valley Forge before. After Washington's defeat, he's going to be able to withdraw. He had tried to attack a smaller outpost at a place called Germantown. That fails. And so Washington is basically going to retreat back to this place called Valley Forge for the winter. He has approximately 12,000 men with him, and they are encamped about 18 miles away from Philadelphia. They're going to stay there for 6 months. They are low on supplies. It is extremely cold. I always remind kids, it's not like they have modern equipment, modern clothing. Imagine camping outside throughout a Missouri winter, and now think of what it's like up north, Philadelphia, New York. This winter was extremely difficult, and in fact, many men would die over those 6 months because of lack of supplies. About 2,000 of the 12,000 soldiers encamped at Valley Forge would die. Just absolutely miserable. Malnutrition, disease runs rampant always whenever you have large groups of people in situations like this. So Valley Forge is perhaps the lowest point of the war for the American side. They look as if they are a defeated force, and there's not much hope left. This is a key moment. Now, the British have really, they have the momentum here, but they make a key critical mistake. And that is, after they take Philadelphia, General Howe is very slow to move. And he could have extended north into Saratoga. In fact, up north, Burgoyne, we talked about him coming south from Canada. Burgoyne is actually expecting that he is getting reinforced by Howe. It never comes. It does not happen. So basically the British could have moved, really combined their armies, and led the British, frankly, to victory at this point. But that's not what happens. After a major defeat at Saratoga, and we'll talk about that on the next slide, Howe will actually end up resigning while occupying Philadelphia. They are still in Philly, and he'll be replaced by another general, a man named Sir Henry Clinton. So Clinton will then be the main leader for the British after that. He will ultimately make the decision to withdraw from Philadelphia and to reposition back at New York in 1778. But before we get there, let's talk about the turning point of the war. This is it. This is a major, major moment in this entire war and, frankly, the history of America. The Battle of Saratoga. And I've put it in bold. Got some asterisks there. October 17th, 1777, a lot of sevens there. This is the turning point of the war. General Burgoyne, as we had seen earlier, had tried to attack Fort Ticonderoga, had failed, was moving southward and trying to clear out basically the Hudson River Valley, clearing out New York. He had about 7,000 men with him. And he did think, as I mentioned on the last slide, he thought that General Howe was reinforcing him, and he was wrong. They were not coming up to New York. They had decided to kind of slow down there, stay in Philadelphia. And so Burgoyne is heading south thinking he's going to run into the British, and what ends up happening is he ends up getting surrounded by the Continental forces led by the Northern General for the U.S., the American forces, Horatio Gates. This is a major, major victory for the Continental Army. The entirety of Burgoyne's army, 7,000 men, end up surrendering to General Gates. And, I mean, this is a major moment in the war. With 7,000 British now captured, that's a huge chunk of their army. And the biggest impact that this has, besides morale, besides decreasing the enemy's strength, the biggest point that this has is the impact on foreign intervention. We have not talked about France yet, but France, you better believe, is paying attention. France and Britain have been lifelong enemies. They have always been fighting. Every few years, there's a new war. We started with the French and Indian War. And you guys saw how, those two had constantly, Queen Anne's and King Philip's and, all these different wars. So France is kind of waiting there, and they're saying, man, the British are really struggling with the Americans over there. This is the battle that they needed to see in order to have the confidence to join our side, right? They're not necessarily wanting another war. It was very costly for them too, and they ended up losing a lot of their empire because of it. But they do see an opportunity here. If they come in and help the Americans gain victory over the British, not only will you have formed a new ally, but man, you have had a tremendously negative economic impact on the British Empire, right? They have just lost, at this point, kind of the crown jewel of their empire. And if the French can come in, it's a win-win for them. So we are going to see a couple treaties signed between the Continental Congresses and the French here. The first one is called the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. And what this did was it recognized U.S. independence and offered trade concessions. So the French say American colonies are free and we will begin trading with them. Of course, that goes against what the British resolutions had said. The second is the Treaty of Alliance. So not only are Americans independent, but France would help fight for the continental side until they won full independence. And both sides, the French and the Americans, agreed not to consent to peace with Britain unless the other agreed as well. Okay, so France doesn't want to declare war, and then all of a sudden Americans say, you know what, we're going to side with the British, and now all of a sudden France has to take us both on, right? So it made sense, but the Treaty of Alliance guarantees that alliance is formed, and it also guaranteed American possessions after the war. That was a big deal, and that's going to actually be a major issue that will lead to the next war, the War of 1812, is Americans getting their stuff back from the British. Let's see. The last major item here is the British shift in strategy. We've had a number of blunders by the British here recently, Saratoga being the biggest of them. And so what you have is a shift that I mentioned on the last slide. You have a shift in general and leadership. You have General Howe being replaced by General Clinton. And the biggest shift is they are going to kind of abandon the northern theater and try to clear out the southern theater. And so they thought that the South had more of a loyalist population, which they did, but they were, I'll tell you, wrong in the aspect that they think if they go down and pacify the Southerners, capture American ports down there, that basically they're going to, be able to regain at least the southern colonies, and they're wrong. Okay, they're going to fight even harder down there. Clinton, I should mention as well. Clinton is ruthless. Okay, he is very ruthless. Howe was. We just saw him kind of dragging his feet after Philadelphia, and it ended up resulting in the loss at Saratoga. Clinton is not taking any chances. He's not only going to go into the South, he's going to bomb American ports. They are going to raid countrysides. They are going to tear up these towns. They're going to burn villages. And they're even going to buy off rebel leaders. And this is where Benedict Arnold will actually make his switch. It's Clinton that gets him to basically switch sides. He accepts that deal in 1780. So, major changes are coming, and we're seeing the war shift south. We're seeing the French get involved. They haven't showed up yet, but they are on their way, and the British are realizing they may actually be in trouble. So, guys, email me if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about this topic, and thanks for tuning in.